World War II dramatically changed the United States from an isolationist country into a military superpower and leader in world affairs. After World War II, most of the Americans at home and the millions coming back from military service wished to return to normal domestic life. They wanted to enjoy the revitalized national economy. However, during the Truman presidency, the growing conflict between the Communist Soviet Union and the United States, this conflict eventually coming to be known as the Cold War, would dampen the nation's enjoyment of the post-war boom. The 15 million American soldiers, sailors, and Marines returning to civilian life in 1945 and 1946 faced the problem of finding jobs and housing. Many feared that the end of the war might mean the return of economic hard times. Happily, the fears were not realized because the war years had increased the per capita income of Americans. Much of that income was tucked away in savings accounts, since wartime shortages meant there had been fewer consumer goods to buy. Pent-up consumer demand for automobiles and housing, combined with government road-building projects, quickly overcame the economic uncertainty after the war and introduced an era of unprecedented prosperity and economic growth. By the 1950s, Americans enjoyed the highest standard of living achieved by any society in history. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, which is popularly known as the GI Bill of Rights, proved a powerful support during the transition of 15 million veterans to a peacetime economy. More than half the returning GIs, as the men and women in uniform were called, seized the opportunity afforded by the GI Bill to continue their education at government expense. Over 2 million GIs attended college, which started a post-war boom in higher education. The veterans also received over $16 billion in low-interest government-backed loans. These loans enabled GIs to buy homes and farms and to start businesses. By focusing on a better educated workforce and also promoting new construction, the federal government stimulated the post-war economic expansion. One sign of the basic confidence of the post-war era was an explosion in marriages and births. Younger marriages and larger families resulted in 50 million babies entering the U.S. population between 1945 and 1960. As this baby boom generation gradually passed from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, it would profoundly affect the nation's social institutions and economic life in the last half of the 20th century. Initially, the baby boom tended to focus women's attention on raising children and homemaking. Nevertheless, the trend of more women in the workplace continued, and by 1960, 1/3 of all married women worked outside the home. The desperate need for housing after the war resulted in a construction boom. William J. Levitt led in the development of post-war suburbia with his building and promotion of Levittown, a project of 17,000 mass-produced, low-priced family homes on Long Island, New York. Low interest rates on mortgages that were both government-insured and tax-deductible made the move from city to suburb affordable for almost any family of modest means. In a single generation, the majority of middle-class Americans became suburbanites. For many older inner cities, the effect of the mass movement to suburbia was little short of disastrous, because by the 1960s, cities from Boston to LA became increasingly poor and racially divided. Uprooted by the war, millions of Americans made moving a habit in the post-war era. A warmer climate, lower taxes, and economic opportunities in defense-related industries attracted many GIs and their families to the Sun Belt states, from California to Florida. By transferring tax dollars from the Northeast and Midwest to the South and West, military spending during the Cold War helped finance the shift of industry, people, and ultimately political power from one region to the other. Harry S. Truman, a moderate Democratic senator from Missouri, replaced the more liberal Henry Wallace as FDR's vice president in the 1944 election. Thrust into the presidency after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, Truman matured into a decisive leader whose basic honesty and unpretentious style appealed to average citizens. President Truman attempted to continue in his New Deal tradition of his predecessor. Truman's proposals for full employment and for civil rights for African Americans ran into opposition from more conservative Congresses. In September of 1945, during the same week that Japan formally surrendered, Truman urged Congress to enact a series of progressive measures, including national health insurance, an increase in the minimum wage, and a bill to commit the U.S. government to maintaining full employment. After much debate, the watered-down version of the Full Employment Bill was enacted as the Employment Act of 1946. It created the Council of Economic Advisors to counsel both the President and Congress on means of promoting national economic welfare. Over the next 7 years, conservative Congresses and the beginning of the Cold War would hinder the passage of most of Truman's domestic agenda. Truman asked Congress to continue the price controls of wartime in order to hold inflation in check. Instead, Southern Democrats joined with Republicans in relaxing the controls of the Office of Price Administration. The result was an inflation rate of almost 25% in the first year and a half of peace. Workers and unions wanted wages to catch up after years of wage controls. Over 4.5 million workers went on strike in 1946. Strikes by railroad and mine workers threatened the national safety. Truman took a tough approach to this challenge, seizing the mines and using soldiers to keep them operating until the United Mine Workers finally called off its strike. Truman was the first modern president to use the powers of his office to challenge racial discrimination. Bypassing Southern Democrats who controlled key committees in Congress, the president used his executive powers to establish the Committee on Civil Rights in 1946. He also strengthened the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, which aided the efforts of black leaders to end segregation in schools. Most important, in 1948, he ordered the end of racial discrimination in the departments of the federal government and all 3 branches of the armed forces. The end of segregation within the military also changed life on military bases, many of which were in the South. Recognizing the odds against passage of civil rights legislation, Truman urged Congress to create a Fair Employment Practices Commission that would prevent employers from discriminating against the hiring of African Americans. Southern Democrats blocked the legislation. Unhappy with inflation and strikes, voters were in a conservative mood in the fall of 1946 when they elected Republican majorities in both houses of Congress. Under Republican control, the 80th Congress attempted to pass 2 tax cuts for upper-income Americans. Truman vetoed both of those measures. More successful were Republican efforts to amend the Constitution and roll back some of the New Deal gains for labor. Reacting against the fact that Roosevelt had been elected president 4 times, the Republican-dominated Congress proposed a constitutional amendment to limit a president to a maximum of 2 full terms in office. The 22nd Amendment was ratified by the states in 1951. In 1947, Congress passed the pro-business Taft-Hartley Act. Truman vetoed the measure as a slave labor bill, but Congress overrode his veto. The one purpose of the Republican-sponsored law was to check the power of unions. Its provisions included several things. First, the Taft-Hartley Act outlawed the closed shop. Closed shop was a contract that required workers to join a union before being hired. Taft-Hartley also permitted states to pass right-to-work laws, outlawing the union shop. This is when workers have to sign a contract to join a union after being hired. Taft-Hartley also outlawed secondary boycotts. This is the practice of several unions giving support to a striking union by joining a boycott of a company's products. Lastly, Taft-Hartley gave the president the power to invoke an 80-day cooling-off period before a strike endangering the national safety could be called. For years afterward, unions sought without success to secure the repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act. It was a major issue dividing Republicans and Democrats into the 1950s. As measured by opinion polls, Truman's popularity was at a low point as the 1948 campaign for the presidency began. Republicans were confident of victory, especially after both a liberal faction and a conservative faction in the Democratic Party abandoned Truman to organize their own third parties. Liberal Democrats, who thought Truman's aggressive foreign policy threatened world peace, formed a new progressive party that nominated former Vice President Henry Wallace. Southern Democrats also bolted the party in reaction to Truman's support for civil rights. Their states' rights party, better known as the Dixiecrats, chose J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina as its presidential candidate. The Republicans once again nominated New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, who looked so much like a winner from the outset that he conducted an overly cautious and unexciting campaign. Meanwhile, the man without a chance toured the nation by rail, attacking the do-nothing Republican 80th Congress and give 'em hell speeches. The feisty Truman confounded the polling experts with a decisive victory over Dewey, a 2 million majority in the popular vote, and 303 to 189 electoral votes. The president had succeeded in reuniting Roosevelt's New Deal coalition, except for 4 southern states that went to Thurmond and the Dixiecrats. Fresh from victory, Truman launched an ambitious reform program, which he called the Fair Deal. In 1949, he urged Congress to enact national health care insurance, federal aid to education, civil rights legislation, funds for public housing, and a new farm program. Conservatives in Congress managed to block most of the proposed reforms, except for an increase in the minimum wage, from 40 to 75 cents an hour, and the inclusion of more workers under Social Security. Most of the Fair Deal bills were defeated for 2 reasons. First, Truman's political conflicts with Congress were strong. And secondly, the pressing foreign policy concerns of the Cold War sort of preoccupied a lot of Congress. Nevertheless, liberal defenders of Truman give him credit for at least maintaining the New Deal reforms of his predecessor and making civil rights part of the liberal agenda. The Cold War dominated international relations from the late 1940s to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The conflict centered around the intense rivalry between 2 superpowers, the Communist Empire of the Soviet Union and the leading Western democracy, the United States. Competition between these powers and their allies was usually conducted by means short of armed conflict. But in several instances, the Cold War took the world dangerously close to a nuclear war. Among historians, there is intense debate over how and why the Cold War began. Many analysts see Truman's policies as a reasonable response to Soviet efforts to increase communist influence in the world. Critics, however, argue that Truman misunderstood and overreacted to Russia's historic need to secure its borders. Conservative critics at the time, however, increasingly attacked his administration as being weak or soft on communism. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union against the Axis powers was actually a temporary halt in their generally poor relations of the past. The Bolshevik Revolution that established a communist government in Russia in 1917 had been immediately viewed as a threat to all capitalist countries. In the United States, it led to the Red Scare of 1919. The United States refused to recognize the Soviet Union until 1933.